everybody, and welcome to our yearly event of the Botstiber Foundation. More succinctly, by the Botstiber Institute for Austrian-American Studies. My name is Siegfried Beer, and I would like to spend just a few minutes explaining to you what the Botstiber Foundation is, and also, of course, why we find the Botstiber Institute for Austrian-American Studies important. The founder of the foundation, Dietrich W. Botstiber, was a young Austrian engineer who, from early childhood on, apparently dreamt about going to America and finally managed to come here in 1938 and lived, one could say, an American dream because at the end of his active professional life, he had so much money that he could create a foundation. And this foundation has been in existence since the 1990s, and many of the administrators of the foundation are with us today. This foundation had basically three larger missions. It has a scholar program by which young, promising, morally sound students are sought today, I think mostly from Saharan countries, to study in the United States, to be exact at Penn State University. It used to be Lehigh University. And many of them study, as the founder of the foundation, engineering, but they can also do other things. That's a first mission. The second mission has to do with wildlife fertility. And the institute was created for wildlife fertility control, which manages, like BIAAS, the Botstiber Institute for Austrian-American Studies, also events, grants, conferences, repository activities, and educational activities. And the third mission is the one that we represent here. The Botstiber Institute for Austrian-American Studies, created in 2007, 2008. And of course, this has as its main function and idea the motto of promoting understanding of the historic relationship between the United States and Austria. And we meet once a year to look over proposals and attempts by young and middle-aged and senior researchers and scholars to find funding for projects in the area of this mission. So we stage also conferences. We have lectures. We award grants and fellowships. And we also, for the last several years, have published or are publishing a journal, the Journal for Austrian-American History. A further attempt is being made to create a kind of resource repository on the issue of this Austrian-American relationship. And connected with this yearly meeting, we have what is called the Botstiber Lecture. And this year This is, of course, also the case. Professor Anton Pelinka will give us his insights into the not always so easy relationship between the United States and Habsburg Austria, as well as Republican Austria. We sort of look at Austria, everything, pretty much everything that was once called Austria. And of course now this is a small country. It used to be something more important in the world. This is basically what the Botstiber Foundation is all about, and the Institute. And I would like to thank the Historical Society of Pennsylvania for providing this venue to us. We stay at the Union League, and we have a partner in this evening's event, the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And I would like to ask Mr. Eli Gilman to come and say a few words about this institute.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Eli Gilman. I'm the Vice President for Operations of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We are a nonpartisan geopolitical think tank based here in Philadelphia. We're really excited to be a part of this lecture tonight. So thank you to the Botstiber Foundation for letting us co-sponsor this event with you. I'd like to say hello to all of the wonderful FPRI members and partners here. If you're not already a member or partner of FPRI and you're interested, there's some material on the table out there. I'd be fired if I didn't give that, so please go take that with you. We were founded in 1955 also by an immigrant of Austria, so it's a special connection for us with the Botstiber Foundation. Ambassador Robert Strauss-Hupé founded us in 1955. He was an immigrant in the early 1920s, came penniless to the United States and was working in the financial industry at the time, and would go back and forth to Europe and saw the rising threat of fascism coming in Europe and would lecture about that across the United States. And it was at an event in Philadelphia where he was giving a lecture where he was invited to be a part of the University of Pennsylvania, where we were originally founded about 30 years later. So we're really excited to be here. If you don't know about FPRI, we are a nonpartisan think tank. We produce scholarly research in area studies and national security. We hold public events, about 60 throughout the year, from New York down to DC. And we have a vibrant educational program where we train students and teachers alike and give them the skills they need to train and be the next generation of foreign policy and international relations thinkers in the United States. So thank you so much for having us, and thank you so much for being here. And I'll turn it over to Reinhard, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you very much. My name is Reinhard Heinisch from the University of Salzburg. I'm a political scientist. I previously was for almost 20 years at the University of Pittsburgh, and it feels very good to be back in Pennsylvania. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce Professor Anton Pelinka today. He's clearly one of the most distinguished political scientists and public intellectuals in Austria today. He's also an immensely well-known public figure who has impacted the discourse and the debate in Austria and beyond about politics and democracy. Born during the war years in Vienna, Anton Pelinka earned his doctorate in law from the University of Vienna in 1964. And he followed that up then with studies in political science at the Institute of Advanced Studies. And that is doubly symptomatic. Because that generation of political scientists couldn't actually study political science at a regular university, because social sciences, in particular political science, was still considered in post-war Vienna sort of a Jewish science, or even worse, a dangerous revolutionary discipline. And especially the law faculty did not want to share its privileged access to the state with a field that it considered not at the same level. The Institute of Advanced Studies was a Ford Foundation created, empirically oriented place of advanced graduate study It was set up by Austrian emigres like Paul Lazarsfeld, and I think there is an interesting, would be a mission for Botstiber to look at this more closely, in an effort to democratize Austria and to offer an alternative to the stodgy, conservative, and highly formalistic studies of politics and the state as was practiced at the university at that time. And nearly all the brilliant political scientists and scholars of that generation went through and graduated from the Institute of Advanced Studies. Then after a stint in Germany, Anton Pelinka came to my university, the University of Salzburg, where he was habilitated. If you don't know what that is, it's a strange Austrian-German ritual that turns a PhD into quasi a professor. Since I never went through that, I'm sitting on committees on that, but it is, for me, a very mysterious process. And then in 1971, he became a full professor at the University of Innsbruck, and he built that department into what was, for a long time, clearly the best department, most respected department of political science in the country. And compared to other political science programs and schools in Austria at the time, the work of Professor Pelinka and of his team at Innsbruck was always empirically rigorous and grounded in meticulous scholarship. His work on Austrian democracy and the Austrian political system was in every sense foundational. He then served also as dean at the University of Innsbruck, and when he retired from Innsbruck, he continued his academic career at the university, Central European University in Budapest, as a professor in the Nationalism Studies program. Professor Pelinka, as I said, is not only a renowned scholar, but also an important public figure who frequently has spoken out in the media and in public venues when he perceived Austrian democracy to be in peril. His criticisms of the far-right Freedom Party of Austria and Austria's blind spot about Austrian history are legendary. Professor Pelinka and I share the dubious distinction of being kicked off the Fulbright Commission when the far-right party got into government. It happened to me last year and happened to Professor Pelinka, I think, in 2000. He is a founding member and founder of many important public institutions and initiatives. I would just mention, as an example, he's a co-founder of the Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies and co-initiator and co-editor of Contemporary Austrian Studies, currently located in New Orleans, headed by Professor Bischoff, who cannot be with us here tonight. But it's a very important academic program and journal dedicated to studying Austrian history and political science. Professor Pelinka has been invited and spent much time at some of the most prestigious universities around the world, including Harvard, Stanford, and Michigan. Has received numerous awards and prizes that I will not mention. I will just say that his work on the radical right is especially important and especially prophetic in a time like this. We're truly fortunate to have him with us today, and his talk is titled Good Uncle Sam, Bad Uncle Sam, the perception of the United States in post-Habsburg Austria. Thank you very much.
So, just have to find my manuscript. So, first I have to thank all of you for the kind invitation to speak tonight about the huge topic, Austrian-American relations. It's an honor for me to be here, and I thank also for the kind introduction you gave just now. This huge field of Austrian-American relationship becomes a little bit smaller when you concentrate on the post-Habsburg Austria. As you know, Austria is not Austria, and until 1918, the easternmost Austrian university was in Czernowitz, which is now Ukraine. And the oldest Austrian university until 1918 was in Krakow, which is now Polish. So old Austria is not the Austria I will talk today, the Republic of Austria, but according to Georges Clemenceau, a quotation which has never been really found, is called the rest of Habsburg Austria. Let me start with some very personal remarks. How come that an Austrian born in 1941 became fascinated with America? America, 1 or 2 generations earlier, was also the title of a novel by Kafka. It was a kind of mystery, but mostly positively seen mystery for Central Europeans, far away but promising. Born in 1941, after the Nazi war machine has started its onslaught on the Soviet Union, and just before Nazi Germany declared war on the United States, born into a very Catholic, middle-class family, what else could I have become but pro-American? I was politically socialized in an environment which cherished Austria's liberation from German occupation, its rebirth in 1945, in an environment which perceived the Cold War as a conflict between good and evil. Anti-Nazism and anti-communism defined the beginning of my political self. The Americans I remember from my childhood were friendly soldiers, organizing Christmas parties in the American-occupied part of Vienna, the first Santa Claus I saw organized by American soldiers. The Americans were driving the biggest and shiniest cars and playing baseball and basketball. The second one fascinated me until today. It does. I'm following the NBA, which at the moment is not so good for Philadelphia, I think. And when the Korean War started in 1950, the situation was quite clear for me. For a Viennese child like me, the US troops under a United Nations command defended the freedom not only in the Northeast Asia, but worldwide. The pro-American attitudes of my childhood were strengthened when I started to study political science, as Reinhard Heinisch has just mentioned, at the institute, which was called the Ford Institute, sponsored by the Ford Foundation, designed by Austrian intellectuals who were able to survive in the United States. Paul Lazarsfeld, as we mentioned, but also Oskar Morgenstern, a star in the field of economics. And in 1967, when I visited the United States for the first time, I met in Berkeley, California, Hans Kelsen, and in Princeton, another Austrian emigre, Robert Kahn. For me, the United States was never a perfect society. In the 1960s, de facto segregation was still visible, and the assassinations of John and Robert Kennedy, as well as of Martin Luther King, expressed a society full of contradictions. Full of the contradiction like the presidency of Lyndon Johnson, who domestically may be called the most progressive president since Abraham Lincoln, but who was also responsible for the disastrous quagmire and the catastrophe of the Vietnam War. For me, the Viennese born as a citizen of the so-called Greater German Empire in Vienna, the United States has been and still is the antithesis of the simplicity of right or wrong, black or white. America is full of complexities, but out of the complexities of America came help for Austria. Austria, the post-1945 small republic, profited from the United States' international engagement, from America, which accepted global responsibility. But who perceived and still perceives the United States as a negative example? And who sees her as a model, not perfect at all, but something Europeans can learn from? All over the last decades in Austria as well as in other parts of Europe, specific anti- and pro-American stereotypes prevailed with specific political consequences. For many Austrians, many Europeans, Americans may be civilized, but not really cultured than Europeans claim to be. Using the distinction, Thomas Mann developed to justify his German nationalism in 1914. Americans, and for Mann in 1914, other Europeans, West Europeans, may have been pioneers in all technological aspects, but Americans were lacking cultural depth. Over the decades, this prejudice was a propaganda tool for Italian fascists and German and Austrian Nazis. America, that was a cold civilization, but America was not culture. Nevertheless, in 1941, Nazi Germany underestimated grossly the American strength, because the United States did not fit into the model of a homogeneous nation state. America's melting pot character was perceived a weakness. And soon after 1945, communist propaganda used another partly similar prejudice, the America of capitalist decadence. That the United States did win World War II, and also the Cold War falsified these variations of another Austrian anti-Americanism. But it would be too simplistic to see this stereotype only from a pure political viewpoint. As Andriy Markovich has argued, in many ways America has been and still is Europe's defining other. Whatever Europe may be, the center of Christian civilization or of secular sophistication, Europe is, according to all the anti-American stereotypes, not America. European traditions, politically on the left or on the right, consider the United States an uncouth nation, either lacking cultural depth or being the vanguard of capitalist exploitation. Many Europeans tend to overlook the decisive role the United States played in Europe after 1941, after 1945, or they tend to forget it. Europeans and Austrians tend to neglect the fact that without American intervention, Europe may have become either Hitler's or Stalin's continent. Whatever we may think of Europe today, Europe is much, much better off thanks to the activism of Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry S. Truman, and Dwight D. Eisenhower. Thanks to an America which did not neglect the world outside the Western Hemisphere. The anti-American prejudice may not fully accept the reality, but it is reality, it is fact. Contemporary Europe is more America than ever. The European Union, as an unfinished federation, follows a textbook which could have been written by Thomas Jefferson or James Madison. Europe today is neither the product of Hitler nor of Stalin and of their murderous fantasies. Europe today is, of course, not the product of Roosevelt either, but from all the major powers who defined Europe's fate in the 1940s, it is America alone which had a long-lasting impact on Europe which is not perfect, but in its deficits, it is more American than anything else. It is not Marxist-Leninist, and even the impact of authoritarian neo-nationalism in Europe might be significant. Mussolini is history. It has been the America of Roosevelt and Truman and Eisenhower which helped Europe to become the most peaceful and the most democratic Europe ever. This America has been the protector of the freedom of the Republic of Austria, the freedom Austria has been able to enjoy in 1945 and in the following years. But let me add a different aspect of America's impact on Austria. In 1918 and in 1919, the Republic of Austria was forced to be independent against its own will, was formed by a disillusionment with Woodrow Wilson and his principle of national self-determination. In 1917, when the Habsburg Empire was fighting for its survival militarily in the European Southeast and South, politically confronted with the different variations of ethno-nationalist secessionism, the principles the US president declared as a kind of justification for the US entry into the Great War seemed to offer some hope for the old Austria, for Habsburg Austria. The very idea of transforming the semi-democratic empire into the United States of Greater Austria may have satisfied Czech and Polish and Italian and Slovene nationalism. As the Austrian part of the empire already accepted the existence of nationalities, giving those nationalities a significant degree of autonomy could be justified by Wilson's concept of self-determination and may have pacified the secessionist motives. But it was too late because the Hungarian part was unable to accept such a concept of federalization and because the declaration of the last emperor and the last Austrian prime minister came too late, much too late. Any possibility to save the empire by redefining it according to Wilsonian thinking was lost by the defeat on the battlefield. During the peace process orchestrated in Paris 1919, Wilson's concept was used to justify the foundation of Czechoslovakia and the secession of Galicia and Bukovina and Slovenia, of Trieste and Trentino. Indirectly, Wilson's concept created the question, what to do with the rest? According to the understanding of this period, the rest was populated with German speakers, that meant at that time Germans, and this rest, after declaring itself a republic, expressed its wish to join the new German, the Weimar Republic, also arguing this is following Wilsonian thinking. But this was prevented by the geostrategic interests of the major powers which wanted to keep Germany as weak as possible. Austria, had to stay independent against its will. The Austrian Republic was created, paradoxically, by the implementation of the Wilsonian principle and, at the same time, in contradiction to the same principle. After 1918, in post-Habsburg Austria, Woodrow Wilson was seen as a naive American who wanted to reconstruct Europe without knowing much of Europe. Wilson's principle of self-determination was in the center of a general disappointment with America. The US president, who wanted to fight a war to end all wars, was seen as the main culprit for the end of European peace. That Europe has always been a murderous continent had been overshadowed by a nostalgic view of yesterday's world, as a famous book of Stefan Zweig was named. Austria and the whole of Europe coexisting with an isolationist America between 1920 and 1941 had to wait until Franklin D. Roosevelt convinced America that the America First idea was not in America's best interest. It was Roosevelt's realistic interventionism which made the America of my childhood the good Uncle Sam. In the years 1933, 1934, and in 1938, the US was the absent power, having no significant impact on Austria's way into the deepest catastrophe in history. In the interwar period, the United States, following the path of isolating the country from world politics, didn't play any significant political role in Central Europe. The end of Austrian democracy in 1933 and 1934, and the end of Austria's independence in 1938 was strongly influenced by the interests of major powers, especially by the interests of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. The United States cannot be seen responsible for the Austrian catastrophe, but it was not a positive factor either. The United States was no member of the League of Nations. The United States seemed to be paralyzed in a post-Wilsonian trauma. The United States was no reference point for Austria, no point of reference, neither in the 1920s nor in the 1930s. But the United States became a safe haven for Austrians, especially after Nazi Germany occupied and annexed Austria in March 1938. Political opponents of the new regime escaped to America, like Ernst Karl Winter or Irene Harand, many, many others. Winter and Harand representatives for the outspoken anti-Nazi wing of Austrian Catholicism. Like Julius Deutsch, the Social Democrats expert in military matters who lived during World War II, mostly in New York City. Austrian Jews exposed to immediate danger made it to the Western Hemisphere, to Mexico and Cuba, to Argentina, and, like Franz Werfel, to the United States. Of course, there is reason to criticize the policy of the US State Department concerning Jewish refugees as not welcoming enough. Of course, Franklin D. Roosevelt had to make concessions concerning American xenophobia to win re-election in 1940. But compared with the catastrophe Europe had brought upon itself, Roosevelt's America was a beacon of reason and freedom more than any time before. Before December 1941, Franklin D. Roosevelt was confronted by the America First movement, arguing against any policy which would have confronted Nazi Germany's aggressiveness. The Roosevelt administration had to be careful not to be accused of violating American neutrality. This changed with Pearl Harbor and with Germany's declaration of war. Now the United States entered again world politics, and among the countries which benefited most of this historical turn was Austria. In his novel *The Plot Against America*, Philip Roth discusses the possibility that Roosevelt may have lost the presidential elections against Charles Lindbergh, who was not the candidate, but he could have been the candidate of the Republican Party in 1940. This plot failed in the novel and in reality. Roosevelt's victory was the best post-Habsburg Austria as well as the whole of Europe could have expected. Pearl Harbor allowed the United States to grow into the role of liberator, of the power strong enough to free Europe from the Nazi yoke and to prevent, almost at the same time, Stalin's control over the whole of Europe. Due to geopolitical facts, this new role of America became especially visible in Austria. Important steps were taken in Moscow, Tehran, and Yalta. The United States became the decisive global actor, favoring Austrian independence directly and Austrian democracy indirectly. In Moscow, November 1st, 1943, the foreign ministers of the three major allies had to prepare something Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin would be able to claim as a diplomatic success later in Tehran. A consensus concerning Poland, the most explosive topic the allies were unable to agree about, was impossible. Hull, Eden, and Molotov were happy to find a topic of secondary importance, Austria. The Allies declared the liberation of Austria from German occupation and annexation as their formal war aim. Austria should not be freed from any responsibility for the Nazi crimes, but Austria should be re-established within the borders of 1937. It means no return to any dream of Habsburg Austria. This pragmatic consensus, the Moscow Declaration, became a stable part of Allied policy in Tehran and in Yalta. On the one side, Austria was treated like Germany, occupied and administered by all the allies, but at the same time, Austria should be treated differently from Germany. And as in spring 1945, the Allies entered Austrian territory. The Allies acted according to the meaning of this formula. But there was reason for the suspicion among the Allies. The Soviet Union had started to establish Soviet puppet regimes already in Poland and Romania. Should Austria become a Soviet satellite like the other post-Habsburg European countries? Due to the principles of the Moscow Declaration, and thanks to the fact in May 1945 all four allies had troops on Austrian territory, Austria did not follow the Polish example. Thanks to the reality of geopolitics in 1945 that implied there was something in the interest of the United States. The way the Red Army treated non-communist Poles, non-communist Romanians, non-communist Bulgarians was something the United States wanted to avoid in Austria and was able to prevent the same fate because there were American troops in Austria. There were no American troops in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, or Hungary. And it was the United States' insistence, aided by the United Kingdom and France, which made it possible that Austria was the only Central European country which did not become a communist one-party state, the exception among all other post-Habsburg states. The Allies together had implemented the Moscow Declaration, allowing the rebirth of Austria as an independent republic. But it had been especially the United States' intention to take care that this independent Austria became a democracy defined by political pluralism, expressed in free elections, and reflecting the Jeffersonian formula, all women, all men are born free and equal. That the political reality demonstrated deficits at Jefferson's time, the existence of slavery. In post-1945 Austria, the opportunistic amnesia concerning Austria's Nazi past has been and still is part of the complex picture. But Austria may now be measured according to the principles enshrined in the American Declaration of Independence and with Austria's direct agreement in the European Declaration of Universal Human Rights. It has been under the auspices of Jefferson's visionary thinking and of James Madison's insistence of checks and balances that Austria started its road into a democratic future. And Austria succeeded in becoming a stable democracy, especially thanks to Franklin D. Roosevelt's decision to end American isolationism. In 1945 and 1955, the United States guaranteed the European balance, which permitted Austria to get the best out of a given geopolitical situation. On April 27, 1945, Austria's provisional government, at a time when Hitler was still alive and Mauthausen not yet liberated by American troops, this provisional government declared its independence from Germany using the Moscow Declaration of 1943 as reference. The Austrian government, a grand coalition, was at the beginning recognized only by the Soviet Union. The Western Allies hesitated because they had reason to see the Renner government, this coalition government led by Karl Renner, as a puppet regime legitimizing Soviet control. It was Renner's personal ability, this ability of maybe the most charming opportunist in Austria's history, to convince the United States authorities in Austria of another reality. But it was even more the United States' insistence to have free elections as soon as possible to create the situation so characteristic for post-1945 Austria. A strong anti-communist coalition government built on the consensus of the moderate left and the moderate right. The result of the elections of November 1945, Austria had elections earlier than most of the other Western European states, had sent a clear message. The Austrian Communist Party represented a very small minority of Austrians. The Truman administration's offer to Austria to participate in the Marshall Plan forced Austria to make a decision at the beginning of the Cold War. Differently from Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, Austria accepted this offer. This sent a clear signal to the world. In doubt, Austria will side with the West. Within the Marshall Plan Organization, the OEEC, Austria was the only country partly occupied by Soviet troops. The Soviet Union had only one option to prevent Austria's beginning Western orientation, to destroy Austria's unity by military force. Stalin didn't want Austria's partition for geopolitical reasons and for propaganda reasons. The breakup of Austria after the country had a democratically elected government recognized by all parties, by all powers, would not have helped the Soviet intentions. The communist "Army go home" slogan, a slogan I very well remember from my own past, has no chance to win the peaceful competition with the soon visible impact of the Marshall Plan. Without siding openly with the Cold War strategy developed under Truman and Eisenhower, Austria decided to join the West economically due to the incentives prepared by the Marshall Plan and politically expressed in the democratic routine of free and fair elections. Austria became a stable Western democracy, and this democratic stability allowed Austria to come to terms with the catastrophes of the past, not so much by an outspoken confrontation with the past, but by the pragmatism of power sharing as expressed by coalition governments and by the network of social partnership. Coming to terms with Austria's Nazi past had to wait. 1945 and the years after, the overall Austrian attitude concerning its recent past was to forget. It needed a new generation of Austrians able to confront actively the past and the still existing anti-Semitism, willing to discuss the reasons why so many Austrians welcomed Hitler in 1938 and participated in the crimes the Nazi regime was responsible for. The necessary precondition for all this was Austria's democratic stability within a peaceful Europe. It is still difficult to assume this would have been possible without the US policy formulated and implemented by the administrations of the presidents Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower. Let me come to an end, to a conclusion with some personal lessons. There is any reason for an Austrian to see the end of the America First campaign and Franklin Roosevelt's political success as a necessary precondition for the well-being of Austria, especially for the Austrians of my generation. My generation experienced the America of the post-1945 years as an opportunity. No other name stands for cultural and intellectual opportunity than William Fulbright. It was an America of political openness, of liberal tolerance. Of course, ambivalence and contradiction again. There was another Fulbright. The senator from Arkansas had to resist desegregation to win elections in his southern state. He had to pay a price for his foreign policy liberalism, like Franklin Roosevelt, who was much less an active civil rights president than his successor, Harry Truman. But the America of the 1960s, which I was able to visit for the first time, was an open society. Its contradictions could be discussed, its shortcomings criticized. Fulbright himself, this very contradictory, important person, the senator opposing Lyndon Johnson's civil rights agenda, was also opposing Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam policy. What a lesson to be learned. Politics not as a conflict between good and evil, between white and black, politics as a competition between different shades of gray. Politics is a search for the lesser evil. My first political science professor at the Viennese Institute of Advanced Studies was Heinz Yu Lau from Stanford University. He explained democracy not as an abstract government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Uhlau went beyond Abraham Lincoln's definition. His explanation was based on the understanding of Joseph Schumpeter, the Republics of Austria first Minister of Finance in 1918 and 1919, and later professor at Harvard. Uhlau, like Schumpeter, defined democracy as the permanent competition for votes, and he invited us, his students, to look for indicators of democratic qualities. The indicator we all could agree upon was the peaceful rotation of power in the consequence of free and fair elections. This is democracy Austria has been able to experience until today. Whenever I try to explain my students for years now at the Central European University in Budapest, explain what democracy means, I refer to this first Monday, the first Tuesday after the first Monday of October 2008. I quote John McCain informing his ardent followers that he had just called Barack Obama to congratulate him. McCain followers started to boo. The Senate of Arizona reacted by telling his students, be quiet. Senator Obama loves this country as much as I do. This is democratic quality. Of course, we don't have any guarantee that this kind of political culture will survive in the future, neither in America nor elsewhere. But we have some evidence that democratic culture was able to take roots in Austria after 1945. And it was able to do so because America's active involvement, represented especially by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Why is Franklin Roosevelt, for me, the Austrian born in 1941 in Nazi-ruled Vienna, the greatest president in the history of the United States? It was Roosevelt and his dedication which transformed American public opinion and ended the dominance of post-Wilsonian isolationism. It was Roosevelt who created America's willingness and America's ability to confront Nazism. It was Roosevelt's Declaration of 1940 which shaped the basic philosophy for the Allies, for the yet-to-be founded, to found anti-Hitler coalition, expressed in one of his famous fireside speeches. Of course, and this is coming really to the end now, this reference to Roosevelt is based on a very personal history. African Americans would have any reason to call Abraham Lincoln the greatest president ever. Political philosophers from any part of the world would call maybe Thomas Jefferson greater than Roosevelt. Roosevelt was not perfect at all. He had an outstanding political temperament, but not an outstanding political intellect. He underestimated Stalin, but he did not underestimate Hitler. It was Roosevelt's shrewd political professionalism which defeated the prophets of America First in 1940 and 1941. Without Roosevelt, I would not be sure whether Austria would ever have been liberated from Nazism and been enabled to flourish as a liberal democracy. Had America First been the winner over Roosevelt, I doubt that we could have today, here in Philadelphia, such a political discourse in political freedom. Last sentence. Hannah Arendt is on record with one especially significant remark concerning academic standards. I quote, "We have to have experience. Experience, what else?" The impact of America on post-1945 Austria is a decisive experience. I think the most decisive experience Austria had for a full era. Thank you very much. down here.
So we are happy to take questions from our speaker. And we have one.
So I want to make a remark that I was born in Vienna in 1939, went through very similar experiences of being in the American zone, you know, becoming an American, an admirer of America early on as a result of these experiences. My question is, has to do with the impact that America had, that the United States had, even in the post-World War I era, namely, as I understand it, by helping to stabilize the Austrian economic and monetary system and ending the hyperinflation of the late 1920s and early 1930s. Could you address that?
To a certain extent, I would say yes, especially humanitarian help organized, for instance, by Herbert Hoover, was especially organized in an American way. The catastrophe concerning humanitarian situation, don't forget, who was Austria in 1945? Were the refugees from Galicia who did not speak German, but were citizens of the Austrian Empire, coming in huge numbers to the new republic, Austrians. There was a huge refugee problem. There was a huge problem of keeping up health care. In that respect, American help was important. But concerning Austria's interest to define itself as a stable democracy, at the beginning overshadowed by this trauma of not being allowed to join democratic Germany, the Weimar Republic, and then to define Austria's independence against Hitler's Germany. The United States politically did not play any role at all. But in a humanitarian way, in that respect, in an economic way, America did play a role, especially immediately after 1918.
Okay, I think so. Sigi? Yes? Microphone?
I actually do share your enthusiasm for Roosevelt, but he was obviously a very ambivalent character as well. For example, he did not agree to the occupation of Austria by the United States before November 1944. He really hesitated. And I always say that the British were the leading force, not only behind the Moscow Declaration, but behind the strategy of dealing with Austria after World War II. It was not so much the Americans. And I sometimes wonder, had Roosevelt survived to the end of the war and had come to Potsdam, and Stalin had told him that his fear of security needs to include Austria, certainly the eastern part of Austria. I'm not so sure. What would have happened?
I cannot disagree, but I cannot agree also, because we don't know what would have happened. Yes, Truman was a big surprise after Roosevelt's death. He was very much underestimated by everybody, by the American public, by the Allies. But especially the Polish case, during the last weeks of his life, Roosevelt started to become disillusioned with Soviet foreign policy when the Soviet troops crushed any kind of non-communist independent Polish structures. I don't know what would have ended. But again, Roosevelt was not perfect at all. Just one example. The British were very much afraid, always in the background of their thinking 1918. The Americans will go immediately away from Europe, retreating from Europe. And the British in 1945, maybe with the help of the French, an unknown factor at that time, would be left alone in dealing with a strong Red Army and the Soviet interests. And it was the main interest of Churchill to keep the United States in Europe. It was a strong interest. But don't forget, when Potsdam started in July 1945, American troops had already occupied significant parts of Austria, already parts of Vienna. So at the beginning, under Roosevelt, the United States kept the formula of Moscow alive. We don't know what would have happened Roosevelt in 1948. I don't think there was any possibility for him running for a next re-election. Maybe isolationism would have returned. In a certain way, Truman was, in my viewpoint, the perfect successor of Roosevelt because he had a different approach. So in that respect, agreement and not full agreement.
We have time for one more question. I see, I'll see two more questions. Okay, maybe start with yours and then go to you, sir. On the right and then one more. Okay.
Your anecdote about the Santa Claus in the American sector after the war is delightful. I'm wondering what other ways the impression of a good Uncle Sam and a bad Uncle Sam can be seen on the ground in Austria in terms of public opinion.
Public opinion in Austria is not easy to deal with because the last free and fair elections in Austria on a national level was in 1930. The so-called plebiscite of April 1938 was neither fair nor free, but we can assume, according to some indicators, if there would have been a free and fair plebiscite in April 1930, don't forget, after the occupation, after the annexation, probably a majority would have decided to stay with Germany. Brenner's declaration, the declaration of the Catholic bishops are the main reasons why I think this is a sound explanation. But of course, not 99%. 99% is also an indicator it's not fair, whatever it is. Neither in the Soviet Union nor in Nazi Germany. So in 1945, and this is the main reason for this amnesia of post-1945 Austria. Many Austrians saw the end of World War II as a liberation from Nazi Germany. Many Austrians saw the events of 1945 as a defeat of us, identifying with Nazi Germany. But I guess, according to all the indicators we have, most of the Austrians would have said, at last the war is over. Whoever is responsible for that, we are not responsible for that, whatever it is. So it was, and don't forget, in a democracy, what is the most important factor is to win elections. And in 1945, even when the members of the Nazi Party were not allowed to participate in the elections of November 1945, there were not many survivors of the Nazi death camps, of the Nazi concentration camps. So there was a very ambivalent feeling. Have we lost? Have we been liberated? Maybe we have been liberated, but maybe we have also lost the war. And maybe all these stories of the concentration camps, there was also the bombing war. There's a long tradition, not only in Austria, but also in Germany, to say, okay, Holocaust is bad, but the bombing war has also been bad, which today I think nobody would dare to say this because it's quite clear. These two phenomena have happened on extremely different levels. But don't forget, the Holocaust was not a topic as it is today. not even in Israel. Tom Seges, The Seventh Million, describes, analyzes, and discusses why even in Israel, the Holocaust at the foundation of Israel in 1947 was not the main decisive factor as it is today. Humanity, societies, needed a generation, a new generation. Don't forget, the first Holocaust memorials in the United States, when did they start? 1980s, 1990s? Again, a generation gap. The same in Austria, but even more significant because many Austrians identified with the Nazi regime, participated actively, even in this specific Nazi regime crimes. War crimes happened before Hitler and after Hitler, but the Holocaust as a unique, an unprecedented case. This is what Yehuda Bauer calls it, and this is the term I prefer, unprecedented. This was not really accepted in its dimension until the 1970s, 1980s. Not even in Israel, not in the United States, and I would say, of course, not in Austria, because there was even this feeling we had co-responsibility, as it was already defined in the Moscow Declaration, Austria's co-responsibility for the Nazi crimes.
So I think we have a last question, sir. You have the...
Since you mentioned the post-war period with the Americans, I would just like to ask you for a short comment. Did the Americans in the American occupation zone in Austria, do a different program from the English and French, maybe in re-education? Was there something special that can be said about it?
I think all four allies tried to re-educate Austrians by different means. And between 1945 and 1955, the first foreign language taught in Tyrolean schools was French, because it was part of the French occupation zone. The first foreign language taught in Lower Austria was Russian, because it was part of the Soviet zone. I happened to go to school in the American district of Vienna, so my first foreign language I learned was English. It was, but the plus of the American re-education was the economic power. America was able and willing to invest much more into different kinds of free education than the Soviets or even the French and British were able to do. This made America very attractive. American reading groups all over Austria in the American zones were attracting different generations of Austrians. There was this freedom in the air. But of course there was also a strong interest in the new French literature in Austria. But America, due to its economic power, succeeded more than the others to have an impact on the thinking of the Austrian society.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our speaker, Professor Pelinka.